So, our next speaker is Steph Bryant, who is the co-director of Schools and Youth Work at the Faraday Institute. She did her degree here in Cambridge in natural sciences and has been involved in a number of conservation and communication projects over the years, not least the God and the Big Bang project, of which she was the first staff member. It's a series of conferences for schools around the country, and Steph is now. We're very glad to have Steph here now and going to tell us about how we explore these questions with children and young people. Thanks, Steph.
Great, thank you. Yes, so as Ruth said, I studied natural sciences at the University of Cambridge, and whilst we're thinking about personal stories, that's actually where I realised that God and Jesus was completely relevant to life today and to the science that I was studying and to all of that. So I personally find it really exciting thinking about science and faith and how those two things fit together in life. But before I go any further in sort of exploring life's big questions with children and young people, I want us to do a little bit of, I guess, imagination work for ourselves. So I work with kids all the time in schools and churches, so you're not going to get away without any interaction. I'm sorry. So, this is confusing because it says, what do you think? But what I'm really asking you is, what do you think a young person you know thinks about a particular question or statement? So put yourself in the mind or the shoes of a 9-year-old or 10-year-old that you know, or a teenager that you know, and I would be really interested to hear your responses on a series of statements. Now, if I were in a primary school, I would say, over here is agree, over here is disagree. I'd get you moving, but I'm nice and kind and you haven't had coffee. So actually, I'll let you just put your hands up for agree, and then put your hands up for disagree, and put your hand up for unsure, don't really know. So the first one is this: science can or will be able to explain everything. So hands up if you think your 10-year-old would agree with that statement. Great, thank you. Hands up if you think they disagree. And hands up if you think they're not really sure. Brilliant, thank you. What about this one? Now we have science, we don't need religion anymore. Hands up, agree. Hands up, disagree. Hands up, not really sure. Thanks. What about this one? Science and religion give different answers to the same questions. It's quite an interesting one. Hands up if you think they'd agree with that. Hands up if you think they disagree. Hands up if they're not sure. Yeah, that's great. And that does tie into also not being sure what that statement is getting at. It's one of those horrible ones where if you mean this, it could be this. If you mean this, which is kind of the nature of collecting information from anyone. What about this one? Science can prove that God does or does not exist. Hands up if you think they'd agree with that, that science has some kind of ability to prove or disprove God. Great, thanks. Hands up if you think they disagree. Hands up if you think they don't really know. Great. And this final one, most scientists are atheists. Do you think they'd agree with that? Do you think they disagree? Or do you think they'd say, haven't really met any scientists? Great, thank you. That's really interesting. And actually, I often use that at the start of a session in a school or in a youth group, just to sort of explore what the viewpoint is in that particular place, because you'll find that there's a huge variation in the answers. Sometimes you go into a school that's completely secular, and they'll all be really excited about the concept of God fitting with science, and they'll be saying, oh, we've thought about this, we've talked about this, we've had a chance to discuss it in a kind of philosophy session or whatever, and you're like, great, okay, well that can reset where I start from in a session that I'm running. Start by listening to what the different people in the room already think. And it's also just a great chance to sort of set the scene. You've started to introduce some language that you might continue to use in a session, and you've got them to start thinking, what are the words that I can be equipped with in order to express what I think about these big topics? Because actually, and I'll come on to this a bit more later, we sometimes hear from people saying, oh, but these topics, these huge questions, they're very grown up things to be talking about. So I'll talk with a 16-year-old about it, but I wouldn't talk with a 6-year-old about it. And I actually really disagree. 6-year-olds will ask the same questions as an 18-year-old or an 80-year-old once you give them the language to do it with. Great. So this is kind of just a slide encapsulating some of what we think society thinks about religion and science and their interactions at the moment. You kind of get these ideas that it's religion versus science, that it's blind faith versus nice, clear, scientific, solid facts, and that faith is either this sort of fluffy, abstract concept, or at its worst is something that's quite dangerous and damaging. And this is something that, you hear about. You get the newspaper headlines that love to sensationalize, love to make an argument out of everything. And so we can be left with this kind of understanding. But it's a pretty negative slide, given that we know that there's a lot more out there as well that gets at, well, how do these things work together? There's a huge amount of work. There's loads of books being published. If you go look at the books all at the back, you can see that there's loads of work being done by people who are thinking about science and God and their compatibility. So given that those are two kind of, different ideas about just the approach to science and faith, one that says, oh no, these two things, it's all about the argument, and another that's all about, well, what are the really interesting and positive conversations? What is it that's filtering down to young people at the moment? And there's numerous research projects that have tried to sort of pin young people down a bit in their thinking. And currently, this is the kind of thing that we would see typically in a school. So this is a good sized survey, and we've asked the young people to agree, disagree, or say they're unsure about this statement at the start of a day. And at the start of the day, a huge chunk of the pie chart there would say that they think the scientific view is that God does not exist, which is essentially saying science has a view on the existence of God, and it's not a good view. So science has something to say about it, and they say God doesn't exist. You've also got a good amount of uncertainty there, and that's good as well, if you can help young people to work out what to do with their uncertainty. And that's not just coming in and lecturing at them and expecting them to go away agreeing with everything that you've had to say. It's how do we support young people in their thinking and in their exploring and in their working out what they think and their worldview. So at the moment, this is fairly standard. This is actually from Church of England schools, this data. So that might surprise you. It doesn't really surprise me anymore, having worked in this area for long enough. So that's kind of data that's being collected. But here are some of the kind of comments as well, which I think can help to sort of root the data in something real or a bit more human in some ways. So this is one student saying, science and religion are at war. They disagree, and it's making me feel uncomfortable with my religion. I want to believe in God, but science is making new answers. This is sense that science is something bigger and better than faith, and it will replace faith. It's this sort of misconception. I don't know what to believe, which is completely fair enough. If you think about all of the information available to young people today, they have the entire internet at their fingertips. They've got teachers, they've got parents, they've maybe got a church leader or a religious leader, they've got newspapers, and it's very difficult to work out who to trust, what to trust, what thing to place value in. Is that website a legitimate website, or is it not? Is it someone just making stuff up? And how do I work that out? There's a lot that young people need support in when it comes to working out what they believe and what to trust. I grew up as a Christian, but science is changing all of it now. So it's evident that young people still think that science and faith are in conflict, that one will replace the other, those sorts of ideas. And this is general. This is definitely doesn't apply to all young people that I've met, but it applies to a lot of them. there are various reasons why young people think science and faith are in conflict. One of them is that actually the vast majority of resources and conferences and things that get at exploring science and faith and how they might fit together in a positive way are aimed at people who are not between the ages of 4 and 18, if I say it politely. So none of this has been filtering down particularly into younger generations. It's something that adults have been discussing and having really interesting conversations about. But what's the next step? And the next step does need to be in working out how do we communicate about these big questions, these big topics to young people? How do we include them in the conversation? And one of the other problems is our current school system, particularly once you get to secondary school. You end up with everything being in neat little categories, and that makes sense because, well, you need to have a certain level of expertise. So it makes sense that a geography teacher is a specialist in geography, a science teacher is a specialist in that particular science, an RE teacher is a specialist in something, but if you ask kids, they're not really sure what it is that they're a specialist in. And so you end up with kids going and doing, 3 science lessons a week, for example, and only 1 RE lesson a week, if that. And everything is compartmentalized. And if you ask them, again, they'll say things like, well, I wouldn't ask my science teacher about God because that's not their subject. And I wouldn't ask my RE teacher anything about science. And so by putting these things in neat little boxes, as we have a tendency to do as humans, we are shutting down this opportunity for cross-curricular thinking and talking around these really fascinating subjects where stuff overlaps. And so that's kind of where we're at. Young people think science and faith are in conflict, and it's kind of partly because stuff isn't filtering down to them. The conversation that we're having isn't always reaching them. And also the way that the school system is set up currently isn't supporting interdisciplinary thinking. And that's partly as well because of the huge time pressure that there is on teachers to be covering a particular curriculum in a particular way. Teachers are very frustrated about this, and I will share some positive news in this area as well as we go on. The other thing that I think, once you've shared a lot of doom and gloom about what young people think, is they still have questions, and they have amazing questions. So don't be thinking that just because they think science and faith are in conflict, that they have shut down and that they're not interested in this. So these are from a whole range of ages, and so I've collected a lot of questions as I go into schools. We're actually working on a book involving some of those questions at the moment. And there are questions that come up consistently, whether a young person is 18 or whether they're 8. So what was before the Big Bang? Does evolution take away the need for God? Where do Adam and Eve fit in? Does science allow for miracles or a soul? If there were a multiverse, how would that affect your faith? What is the meaning of life? If God is so loving, why is there so much suffering? That one comes up every time I go into a school, no matter the age. It's always asked, and it's not asked as a clever, I'm going to come up with, if God is all powerful and all loving, then why does bad stuff happen? It's asked genuinely as a why does bad stuff happen in this world? You get some wonderful curveballs as well, working with young people. You get things like, if you went and stood in the sea for long enough, would you become a mermaid? Lots of brilliant questions. So they're not shut off to considering these big topics. And like I've said, if you equip them with the words that they might need in order to ask their questions, in order to frame their questions, then they ask brilliant and wonderful and sometimes hilarious questions about it all. Well, does it matter? Could we just leave them to it until they get a bit more grown up and then come along to conferences like this one? It absolutely matters. I'm sure you're agreed. Because young people today, from my own personal experience, if I'd have just gone through the rest of my life thinking, well, science is the only thing that I need, then I'd have missed out on this huge and wonderful part of my life. But also, the big questions that we have, like, who am I? What should I do with my life? How can we solve the climate crisis? these are the kinds of questions that we need to bring science into, but we also need to bring other important human ways of knowing in if we want to come to a more rich and full understanding of how to approach some of these big challenges that we're facing. So I would argue that yes, it really matters that we're at the moment creating this situation where young people feel like they have to choose between science and faith. The good news is there's loads and loads of stuff being done now. In the last few years, we've really seen a lot of interest and a lot of really positive developments. So you've got Messy Church, and Messy Church does science. There's a great book that they've produced full of experiments and some sort of gentle introduction of some kind of faith concept alongside that experiment, which just is a chance for someone in a church to do some fun science with young people. And if at the end of the day, young people leave that and all they have got to grips with is, one day I did some really fun science in a church with a Christian, that's a wonderful seed to have sown. That's incredibly powerful. God and the Big Bang, as Ruth mentioned, has been doing great work in schools. Faraday Kids, that's us. We've been doing some really good work in schools and churches and beyond. I'll share a bit more about that. And Epistemic Insight, which is part of the LASAR group, so learning about science and religion, they have been working at sort of the university level with people who will go on to teach. They partly spend their time thinking about learning, so learning about learning, and therefore thinking, well, how should we teach? How should we shape the way that we teach in schools to better reflect learning and how we best learn, for example? And they're doing really great stuff, and I'm very hopeful that we'll see the way that teaching and education works changing as that gains traction and credibility. So, the Faraday Institute in schools. Why schools? So I know that actually, as Andrew was saying, if you have contact with a school, it's well worth thinking about this as an opportunity, not just thinking, well, what can I do with a youth group at church, but what can I do with young people in schools? And that's partly because young people spend a huge amount of their time in school, and actually when they're there, they're expecting to learn, they're expecting to be challenged, they're expecting to think and take on board new ideas. And so if you can work with them in that setting, it's actually a really great thing to be doing. So over the last 5 years, the Youth and Schools team at Faraday have done about 700 sessions, reaching a lot of young people between the ages of 3 and 18 on a whole range of topics. And I really want to spend most of the rest of this session just sharing a bit about what that looks like and what we've learnt through doing all of that, so that you can hopefully think about, well, what could I do to reach young people as well? What can I take away from my particular setting? Because I think even though a lot of our time has been in schools, a lot of what we've learned is applicable across the board to contact and working with young people. Young people enjoy our days. Some of the things that I think are really interesting when you collect feedback are that young people enjoy days that are interactive and hands-on. So if you can think about a simple experiment that you could do, again, Messy Church Does Science has a great book of experiments. That's a good start. They're not really up for being lectured at, for an hour on something. So if you can think about interaction and hands-on stuff for young people, that really helps cement what you're talking about. Just to give an example of some of the topics that we've gone in and spoken on. Big questions. Young people have lots of questions, so if you can frame things around big questions, that's exciting. Unpacking that and thinking kind of questions that are scientific, questions that are faith-based, questions that need a bit of both of those things to tie into. That's quite a good start, but you can talk on all sorts of topics, fossils and faith. I talk about creation care or our amazing planet quite a lot because my background is in particular in conservation science. There's loads and loads of topics that we could speak on. And what I want to say about that is actually, I think sometimes we think, gosh, I need to be the world leading expert in a topic before I can start to speak about it anywhere. And that's not true. It's very, very useful to know plenty about it, but to know more than a 6-year-old, unless it's dinosaurs, you don't actually need to have done loads and loads and loads. I think people can feel very intimidated by it. But young people actually aren't looking necessarily for the most intelligent argument to wow them. They're looking for honesty and integrity and passion and fun. And if you come across as someone who loves the science, is excited by the science that they're discovering, is still on a journey of discovery with the science, then that's something that they will really connect with. They want to connect with the human aspect of things. And so I loved the idea, the new scientist idea, because one of the issues that we have is that science is constantly changing and it can be quite tiring trying to keep up with it all. But it doesn't take that much. If there's one topic that you love that you pick to just keep on top of, that's not a huge amount. And by keep on top, I mean know what happened in the last few years. So I've been working recently on just a page of a book that we're working on, and it's a timeline of like various events over the history of Earth. And I've been looking at the dates and thinking, these were right in 2009, and 2009 doesn't seem that long ago. But it's 2020 and a lot has happened since then in the scientific community. And so it's just having that awareness. If you find a website out there, an article out there from 2009, can you find something more recent on it as well? Can you find a way of updating understanding? So lots and lots of different topics we can talk about. And don't be intimidated to just have a look, have a think about things. Because like I said, kids aren't looking for the world-leading expert. They're looking for someone that if they ask a question to them, they can say, wow, that's a really interesting question. I haven't really thought about that before. I'm not really sure. Let me look it up for you and get back to you. Or, if you might not see them again, let me look up a useful website for that and send it to your teacher, and your teacher can look at it with you. Or, I'm not really sure. That's a really great idea. I'm going to look into it. But here is what my first few thoughts are on it. Because they know if you're blagging. Like, they know instantly if you're blagging. And they're not interested in that because blagging seems dishonest, and how can they trust you? But if you say, I don't know, that's very powerful, especially in our current school system where everything is about, here's the question, here is the right answer to write down to get the mark. If you say, I'm not sure, but here's how I go about figuring out more, you are modeling what to do in a world that is actually uncertain and full of mystery. And that's really powerful for them, full stop, whether that's in a scientific career they might go into or thinking about big questions about faith. That's a really powerful thing. So don't be afraid to say, I don't know, but also don't be intimidated to find out a little bit more. So as Andrew was saying, when I go into a school, the first thing that I do is establish scientific credentials. And that's not saying I have 51 PhDs, but it's about at least demonstrating you know about the science or the scientific developments of the last few years by checking out the BBC website, for example. But it's about sharing something that really excites you about a particular area of science. So it could be fossils, it could be how many billions of stars there are in our galaxy, for example. Set the scientific scene, and young people are on board and they're listening to you at that point. Because up until that point, if they've heard, oh, well, you're a Christian who's coming in to talk about science, they're going to be a little bit suspicious. And so when you start setting the scene about things like the age of the Earth or how many stars there are in the galaxy, something about the Big Bang, something else, they're starting to think, oh, this person really is on board with science. And so they're open and they're listening. So, a little bit of science just to prove to you that it's really very simple. The other reason, actually, before I get onto this, that it's important to start sometimes with science is that it allows you to ask the question, what is science and how does it work? And that seems like a really silly question because they've been doing science in school their entire life. But very few people know that. know the answer to that question. You'll get a stunned silence when you ask it. And to be honest, I think you might have got a stunned silence if you'd asked it to any of my lecture theatres as well while I was a student here. I think you can get all the way through a science degree without actually having to really think about what science is and what it's founded on, and what it's based in. So there you go. Worth asking, what is science? So what is science? Can anyone tell me? Say again? Knowledge, yeah. It's a particular kind of knowledge, yes.
Doing stuff to try to find out stuff to maybe one day know stuff.
Yeah, that's great. So it's a collection of our current best understanding of how the universe works, but it's also the process of building up that collection of knowledge. Yeah, so the observation of phenomena, in this case particularly we think about the physical world and what we can observe, and it's then trying to work out, well, what does that mean? How does that fit into our current model and our understanding of the world around us? Thank you. So we're going to have a bit of a think. And you tend to start with a bit of a question. So, question, what is in the bottle? Clear liquid, water, had a mixture of things? Okay, great. So what do we know about water? Because once we have a question, there's no point like spending forever researching something that we've already are very confident about. So what can you tell me about water? It's drinkable. Yeah, thank you. Colourless, odourless, tasteless, chalky in Cambridge. Yeah, great. If I try and set fire to it, it's not going to set fire? You reckon it probably won't set fire? Great. Okay, so we know quite a lot about water, H2O, already. And there's not much point in pushing further on. Shall I try and set fire to it or anything like that, as fun as fire is? Great. Okay, so that's one thing we know quite a lot about. What is this? Looks like a £20 note. Could someone verify for me?
I've got a pen. It's a very good forgery if it's not.
Looks like a £20 note. Seems legit. Great, okay. What can you tell me about £20 notes? Knowing from our current understanding of the way the world works and our best collection of knowledge currently, what can you tell me about it? Say again? Yes, you can exchange it for something else. Exactly. It's this funny little bit of paper that actually represents gold, and that allows me to get stuff from a shop. Probably won't dissolve in a glass of water. Yep. But it will set fire. Great, okay. So what happens if I take something that won't set fire, something that will set fire, and I mix them together and then I try and set fire to it? So now we've gone from stuff that we know lots about to something where we're trying to combine those bits of information. We're asking something new. Knowing what I know, what do I think will happen? So what do you think will happen? Soggy mess. Great. Shall we find out? This is the point in schools, which is brilliant, because they don't think I'm going to dunk a £20 note in water and set fire to it. Okay, who thinks it's going to burn?
Is it paper or plastic?
It is not plastic, it's paper, and that is important. I can't do this with £5 notes or £10 notes anymore.
The health and safety girl.
Yep.
Can I be your assistant? There we go.
Where are you
Oh, I
going?
don't know. It's just, oh, you're putting it on the
Yeah.
That's all.
This is to make people think that I might actually set fire to something. Great, okay. Who thinks it's going to burn? Who thinks it isn't going to burn? Who's not really sure? Who hopes I'm not going to actually burn a £20 note? Great, let's find out. It wasn't water. Great. So I still have a £20 note. The next stage, so we've done our experiment and we made observations. So what did you see? What did you observe?
It appeared to burn, but it hasn't.
Yeah, it appeared to burn. There were proper flames going around the note, but I still have... So if it wasn't water, now we're curious. We've got more questions, and science is always about asking questions. Whether you saw what you expected to happen or not, you end up with more questions. So, if it wasn't water, what was it? What do we know about alcohol when you set fire to it? And so if I dip something that burns, like paper, into something that definitely burns, like alcohol, and set fire to it, what would happen? I would not have a £20 note left. Great. So, any other suggestions before I reveal? It wasn't magic.
The £20 notes, paper pulp, came from the same bush that Moses...
Yes, you got it. Brilliant. No. But definitely the kind of answer you might get in a school. So actually this is a mixture of water and alcohol. And so the alcohol is what you see burning, and the water keeps the paper cool enough that it doesn't set on fire. So you're left with a soggy note and the alcohol is all burnt off. So that is what was going on there. And now I have to remember to not drink that for the rest of the talk. So you see, that was just a really simple little bit of science to kind of explore, how does science work? What is the process? It's a process full of asking questions and making observations. And then with the observations, we kind of ask more questions and we can keep digging. We can try and test more and more to try and understand or build up a better picture of the world. So we knew what happens if you set fire to water. We knew what happens if you set fire to paper. But then we introduced the mystery, we introduced the next step. And science is always about building on our best current understanding. So start the discussion with what science is, how it works, because that's fundamental and often neglected, and is where a lot of the misconceptions come from. Even just by saying, well, science answers a particular type of question really well, and that's about observing the physical world around us, the physical natural processes of the world around us. It gives science its wonderful limitations, and it's inside those limitations that science is powerful. And that allows us then to move on to things like this. But does science answer all of our questions? So for example, down here, we've got this question here, the climate is changing, why aren't we? And we've known about climate change for decades now, and we're still not doing enough. Why not? Because we know the science is clear, so it's clear that there's more than science to this bigger picture. And we've got to find something else that will help motivate us. Or we've got to realize that humans are more than just, say, the scientific understanding of things. We've got to figure out more within that big question. You have very important questions like the kettle. Why is the kettle boiling? All of those things. So it's really important at this stage to recognize that science is not the only reliable source of knowledge. And so we can start to ask questions about some of the other human ways of knowing, including faith. And that enables us to have important conversations about, well, what do you think faith is? We've talked about what science is. What is faith? And you can talk beyond sort of this misconception of blind faith. You can challenge that and say, well, faith is also about evidence. It's also about taking these steps of collecting information from the world around you to come to a conclusion about your best current understanding of the bigger picture. And it's hopefully, like science, a dynamic thing, which I will always be confident to challenge and add to. I will continue to grow my faith as I take in new information about the world around me as I go through my life, in the same way as the sciences will continue to add to that collection of knowledge themselves. And one of the big things that is just important to leave young people with generally, one of the things they find quite powerful is starting to realize that they have really big questions like, who am I? What's my identity? And in helping them to see, well, what can science bring to that conversation? You're supporting them in helping them to see what can faith bring to that question, what can history bring to that question, what can poetry bring to that question. You're helping them to see that life isn't just these neat little boxes and these neat little categories. You're helping them to think in a way that is really enriching and powerful for the way they tackle big questions in their future. And so once you've done a bit of, well, what is science, what is faith, that's really great. That could be a good place to finish, but actually there's lots of other things that you can talk about too. You can dig deeper into big questions like evil and suffering. It's a cheerful topic for schools, but so important. Or some of the more kind of, well, if you are saying that science and faith are two different things that add to the same big picture, what happens if it looks a bit like they're saying different things? How do I read the Bible? How do I interpret Genesis? So there's lots of things that you can dig deeper into. And if you're finding those sorts of things kind of intimidating, or you're thinking, these are massive philosophical concepts, I don't really want to talk about them with a 4-year-old, how do you do that well? Tell them stories. Tell them stories about scientists historically or scientists alive today, or share your own personal story. Because actually it's in telling stories that we help young people to connect. Like I said, they're not interested in lectures. I actually think if most of you heard Once Upon a Time or Let Me Tell You a Story, you'd sit up and you'd be paying attention, because that's what we're really interested in. It's about making some of this about the human story as well as just the sort of scientific facts of something. So sharing quotes from people like Jennifer Wiseman on how she sees science and faith fitting together, that could really help. Sharing a story about, rather than just saying E equals MC squared, telling a story about someone like Einstein and where he came from and what his challenges were, both as a person and as a scientist. That just breathes life into this conversation and makes it really accessible for all people, but especially young people. Okay, so what's the impact of going into schools and spending even just a few hours with some young people? So this is from the same set of data. This is what students thought in the morning. This is what they thought after the intervention. And you see that there's a massive change. So I believe science and religion can fit together. That's teenagers, 15-year-olds, changing their mind about whether science and faith can fit together. And that is really exciting. But at the start of the day, 55% of these young people were saying science makes it hard to believe in God. And by the end of the day, that figure had fallen. There's a few who are more uncertain, but I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think, again, if we've modelled what to do with our uncertainty, then you've set them off in a really interesting direction. Final one I want to share today, evolution is compatible with creation by God. This is a really nuanced and interesting kind of question, and you've seen just through a few hours spent thinking about this with kids, you've seen a real change in position. And so it's worth doing these things, and actually they can change their thinking over quite a short period, which is really exciting when you're working with teenagers. They love things like the Q&A sessions. If you give them space to ask their questions and you respect their questions, even if they're silly, even if you think, oh, well, that's a daft question because it shows you don't understand all of these things. Sure, they're 15, they're not going to understand everything. So respect the question and say, that's really interesting. Here's what I think. And they love that. And here, this second comment here, they answered questions that people are often afraid to go into. I think that's so important because we, with the best will in the world, will avoid difficult topics and questions with young people. But if they ask, where do Adam and Eve fit in? And we don't want to mislead them because we're not really sure where Adam and Eve fit into this. And we say, ask someone else, or that's not really my thing. They've instantly picked up on, they asked a question and it was bad because they've made you uncomfortable or you've dismissed it. It was the wrong question. And it wasn't the wrong question. It was a brilliant question. And so just affirming, saying, wow, that's fantastic. Here, let me think about that. Here's my initial thoughts. Here's someone else you could talk to. Let me find an expert on Adam and Eve or a book I could lend you. Rather than dismissing their questions, that's something that is really, really powerful. Okay, so that is our work in schools. But we are going beyond that at the Faraday, more and more. And this is really our vision, changing the nature of science-faith communication to generations of children, young people, and their influencers. Sometimes we say teachers, sometimes we say influencers. Basically anyone who ever talks to a young person is an influencer. So we are working on a website that will have lots of big questions on it, on a whole range of different topics. One aimed particularly at kids, one aimed at teenagers, and one aimed at educators as well. We're carrying on adding stuff to that. The website is up. The kids one is the most populated so far, but we're always going to be adding kind of answers and different questions to that. So that could be a first great step. If a kid asks you a question and you're like, oh man, I don't know, why don't we go look at this website and see if there's anything on there yet? And if there isn't, why don't we ask those nice people at Faraday if they could provide a sort of 100-word answer on this thing? So that's our website. We're working on 17 different book and app resources at the moment. The Curious Crime is out. That's for teenagers. Wonder Zone is out. That's a holiday club with Scripture Union. So we've been trialing that, and it's out now. It will be in use this summer and beyond. So that's very exciting. God Made Space, God Made the World, and God Made Animals are for 3 to 5 year olds, and they're a really gentle exploration of this is how we think God did it. So just a lovely, gentle exploration of the kind of science for very little people with beautiful pictures. And all of this is about just trying to really explore the wonder of science and introduce God into that as well. Because at the moment, there's lots of kids' books on day 1, God did this, on day 2, God did this, and they're beautiful picture books about Genesis. And there's lots of really fun science books out there, but there's just nothing out there that is particularly helpful at exploring science and faith gently. And we really want the nature of science-faith communication to be different. We want it to be something where this sort of book is just not a surprise, where it's not a surprise that these things exist. So that's what we're working on. Watch this space. More are going to be published in the months ahead. So before we have a little bit of time for questions, what can you do? Well, you could pray for the work of the Faraday Institute. You could spread the word. If you have schools in your area and you don't have time to go in, or you're worried that you don't have the expertise, despite what I've said, to go in and work with them, point them in our direction. You could donate. I'm sure none of you are millionaires, but the work of the Youth and Schools programme requires funding. Getting into schools do not have a large budget for this kind of thing, and so if any of you is a millionaire, please feel free to donate to us. Or very other worthy charities, I'm sure. But more importantly, I think it's worth you encouraging the young people that you come into contact with, thinking about how you can do that, whether it's just pointing them to our website or buying them books as they come out. Or whether it's just saying, those are brilliant questions. Those sorts of things will encourage young people to see that science and faith are both important areas of life, and that you can ask questions about those two things together. Again, if you're worried about expertise, take part in some training. I mean, it's great that you guys are here. You're clearly willing to learn. And now if you think, what have I learned? And how can I simplify that and make it something that's accessible to young people I know? How can I take these big ideas and talk to kids at my youth group or anything like that? And that's a brilliant first step. So running your own sessions, absolutely brilliant thing to do. And at the end of the day, it's about telling your story or telling the stories of people that you know. And that's important when it's the story of Jesus, but it's also really important if it's a story of, there was this brilliant scientist and they loved God. Because if that is what you leave young people with, then you are challenging this misconception that is so widespread that science and faith are in conflict. You're just sharing a different story with them, and that is so powerful. So thank you so much for listening. Back to Ruth.
Good, and now we have time for some questions. If anyone has, yes, Ashley.
One of the things that really struck me on the last but one slide, I think it was that the feedback was that it encouraged independent thinking. How many churches encourage independent thinking from their young people?
So, I mean, this is a really interesting point, and I think we can often feel that doubt is not a good thing. But doubt is a good thing, because doubt is just asking questions. And if you can support young people in where to take those questions, what to do with those questions, then you are going to be strengthening their faith. So encouraging independent thinking, encouraging what has been labelled as doubt, when really it's just amazing big questions, then that's a wonderful thing that we can be doing. I think the more that we say, oh no, don't ask those questions, because we're worried that those questions will shake faith or rock the boat, it's not going to stop young people from asking those questions, but you are shifting where they can find answers to those questions away from the church, and you're making it seem irrelevant, and that's a shame.
That was great, thank you.
Thanks.
Can you say something about context, your different schools you go into, in the sense that I live and work in East London, so if I go into a school in Newham, for instance, East Ham, there are hardly any children who don't believe in God, because the multi-faith aspect, high proportion of Muslim kids, they all believe in God, unlike when I used to be in other areas where if I asked that question, there'd be a much minority or a 50-50 split or something. So does it make a difference when you're in a more multicultural situation?
Yeah, there's a huge variety, as you're suggesting. Like, if I went out into like the outskirts of Cambridge, I might find a school where actually they're very, very scientifically literate, and they'll say things like, "My daddy says that faith is a crutch," and you know, so that's a very different setting to a school in, say, inner city London, where you have a huge respect for God and for faith. So there's always differences like that. When it comes to working with children of different faiths, I think that's fine. I think that we need to be sensitive in that, but that's where telling your story can be a really powerful way in. So you're not coming in and trying to undermine anybody's faith or worldview, but you're saying, this is what I know from my personal experience, and that's powerful. And young people, they don't like you telling them what they should think, but they're really interested in what you think and why. If you can just create a space for sharing it that is less about lecturing them and more about saying, come see what it means to have been human in my life so far. And so that's the way that I find speaking to different faiths can really be helpful and create space. It's also always worth thinking about where different faiths could be coming from with it. So the monotheistic religions, they're all very, the Abrahamic faiths have all been important for the development of science and mathematics. They tend to all come at it from, well, there is this one God and he is in control of everything. And so it makes sense that the world is comprehensible. So that's a common ground viewpoint that we all might share if we are part of an Abrahamic tradition, faith tradition. But there are other nuances. So what a Muslim might think about Adam and Eve and why questions about Adam and Eve and evolution might concern them are actually slightly different from why that might concern a Christian. And so sometimes those nuances are worth being aware of, as well as the similarities. But at the end of the day, sharing your own story, regardless of the context, being sensitive to the context, but also just sharing your story will be powerful.
Any more questions? Oh, yes, someone here at the front.
I hope this is not a distraction, but I know you portray science as something, it's discovery, exciting, Christians are involved. Do you ever put over the idea that religion is something exciting and developing? I'm married to a theologian and who's a feminist, and she's written a book about the emergence of women interpreting scripture from the pulpit, and what does that mean? And it's changing things, and it's developing, and it's just as exciting as getting to the moon. Do you ever?
Yeah, definitely.
It's static, we're defending the truth.
Yeah, I think I always really enjoy drawing the similarities, actually, of the scientific method and process of development and faith. If it's faith at its best, is something that will be dynamic and changing. Not just, oh gosh, we made a new scientific discovery, we better work out how that affects our interpretation of scripture. Not that kind of dynamic, but yeah, an ongoing questioning, learning, pursuit. And from a personal level, I'm going to go through my whole life hopefully being surprised by God and learning more about him. And so yeah, I like to draw the similarities between faith and science as dynamic pursuits of knowledge and truth, definitely. And actually young people are surprised that science is exciting too, because they sit in lessons and they get taught discoveries that were made 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and they're often given the impression that all the best bits of science, all the important things and all the important discoveries have already been made. So with both of these areas, if you help give them the impression that there's so much more left to know and so much more mystery out there, then that's great.
Oh, good. Any more? Yes, right behind you.
Thanks. I was just going to say, I have two granddaughters who are 6 and 8, and they were taught this last academic year about science and faith being in conflict. And I said, oh, what do you think about that? And the youngest one said to me, well, that can't be right because both Daddy and Grandpa are scientists and they're Christians. And clearly that didn't answer everything, but I was encouraged that their basic point was, well, there's something here to explore, rather than just to put away or just to take the line that there's conflict there. So I suppose my observation is that I think as scientists we can help not just grandchildren but those around us in our churches a lot by being living examples that there isn't a fundamental conflict there.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And I think just a couple of points to draw out of that. That means that if we are a scientist in a congregation, we should be willing to share about that. Because if people don't know that you're a scientist, then they can't be encouraged by that story. And it also demonstrates the power of story for young people. You know, they've been taught a particular thing at school, but there's something that's flagged something for them. They already know, but in my story and in my experience, I know someone who is a scientist who loves God. And so they've instantly got this other kind of framework to be setting that new bit of information within that helps them to think there's a conversation to be had here. And so that's brilliant. The more we can be open and share both our faith and our love of science, the better. So yeah.
I would very politely go back to that school and challenge why that's being taught, because I'm not aware that's in the curriculum.
Yeah, my son has.
Good. There's a parental information. So thank you very much, Steph, for all that.